Senator Kennedy. Senator Ernst?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thanks so much. I'm going to talk a little bit more about rules, regulations. Mr. Menke, I'll turn to you. Recently, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, published a proposed heat rule. And OSHA estimates the proposed rule would affect millions of small businesses and employees. And so I'm just concerned, that's just one example of many, many rules that have been pushed out by this administration. And I don't know that the administration is properly considering small businesses when they are publishing these rules. They're not taking a look at the unique needs of small businesses. So I've heard about this particular rule. It's just one example. I've heard of many other examples coming from Iowans. In your current role, how has increased regulation and red tape affected the agriculture industry in Iowa?
Well, we see it every day, and the ag industry is already subject to plenty of regulation, and the list keeps getting longer. We've got EPA's rolling out its herbicide strategy and pesticide strategy under the Endangered Species Act. New regulations that are going to be very costly, complex, and with very few compliance options. We're also concerned that some of the tools that we have to be able to use are being taken off the table, with the label registration for over-the-top dicamba use unlikely to be completed for this 2025 growing season. So new regulations and red tape need to be considered very thoughtfully and seriously, as adding new layers of compliance and taking important tools off the table can become a direct time and cost burden for our producers. One of Secretary Negg's biggest priorities is the future of agriculture and promoting careers in agriculture. And if farming becomes too costly, cumbersome, and limited due to government regulations, we run the risk of driving future farmers away from the field. And make no mistake that over-regulation impacts the small farmers the most and the new and beginning farmers the most. So, and important to note that the cost of production continues to go up, and regulation and red tape is a part of that. That will eventually make its way to the cost to the consumer. And we're seeing that now in California with Proposition 12, as cost of pork has skyrocketed due to that regulation. So we are blessed with the safest, most abundant food supply in the world. That's something we should never take for granted, and we don't want to put that at risk.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for that. Iowa is home to over 89,000 small family farms, and I was blessed to grow up on one of those small family farms. And my fear is, with the overregulation coming from the federal government, and I think we can all agree, we all want to be safe with our activities on the farm, but overregulation, it is going to drive these smaller farms out of business. They're just not going to be able to comply with all of the standards that the federal government is laying down on them. It forces them to sell. And I hear from federal government all the time about big ag and big ag industry and how awful it is. But that, unfortunately, is what this federal government is driving us to. So I think we need to consider our small family farms as small businesses, and we need to consider the level of regulation that is heaped upon our small farms and our small businesses. So thank you for that. And let's see if we've got maybe some other questions. Oh, yes. Mr. Barker, I'm going to go back to you just for a final question, just very briefly. In your testimony, you stated your bank represents millions of assets and often has to navigate the same rules as larger banks. We've kind of touched on this. But again, keeping in that regulatory theme, how do those regulatory requirements disproportionately burden community banks in comparison to the larger banks? And how do you see that get passed on to consumers?
Well, it affects us in our costs. We have similar costs to the larger banks. And so it affects our operating budget. And when it affects operating budget, it has to be passed on with higher interest rates on loans, lower interest rates on deposits, maybe fees on deposits that we don't normally want to do and can't. So it stretches us very thin. But eventually it could filter down to the customer.
Yeah, oftentimes, again, just sticking with that theme, the regulation that's pushed out from the federal government, when we don't consider the size of the business or industry,
Right.
it's very harmful. And we
Yes, it
lose
is.
more of our smaller banks, our smaller businesses, and our smaller farms. And again, just want to thank you all so much. This has been really helpful for me, understanding the different dimensions from USDA and SBA. And thank you very much, Madam Chair, for convening this great panel today.